I'm really excited to welcome my guest, Dr. Esty, today. She's written a really fascinating book called Conquering Concussions. It's got a specific chapter that may be interested to the veterans that are watching about wounds of war. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation.
How did you get into your profession?
Well, as with any interesting story, it started in ways that I never thought of. I never dreamed I'd be doing what I'm doing now and enjoying it so much. I'd always been interested in medical issues in general, medical care. And during my graduate years, so I have a degree in social work, and there are 2 years, and so in between I was on a VA scholarship for graduate school, so veterans obviously had a big part of that. I was given an internship between the 2 years in a veterans hospital, and at that point they were treating World War II vets and Korean vets. Also, I had a brother who had served in the South Pacific in World War II, and my only memory of that, and maybe it was from photographs, was how wonderful his Navy uniform looked. And he was in Guadalcanal, and coming to the present is looking back, he never talked about what he'd been through.
Really?
Until he was in his 80s and knew that I was treating veterans, and then he started talking.
So you got your degree in social work and started learning about some of the interesting treatments that were available for veterans, but you also saw some of the problems that they were having coming back and adopting into society.
Right, and even very early, these veterans, of course, from World War II were much older, but having major problems. And of course, there wasn't much then beyond medication.
Really?
That was pretty much all that was available. So what happened was, because of my interest in social work is a very broad field, and biofeedback is in the scope of practice of a social worker. Biofeedback is an umbrella term. It covers a variety of technologies that can pick up some kind of physiological information from the body, including the brain, and present it back to the client, to the person in question who's struggling with some issue that will help them improve their functioning, whether it's cognitive or physiological. So one of the earliest, and I began using biofeedback for people with a variety of medical conditions in 1988, actually. 1994, I began with first neurofeedback system, and they were pretty new back then, and compared with what we have today, if you think about how computers have changed in general, the same thing is true of neurofeedback. So I had a system, and I'm going to use that as a segue into the power of this kind of information coming back to people, and to change them in the process of acquiring that information. I was brought a young woman who had attempted suicide multiple times after some brutal trauma when she and her friends went to the beach to have a party, a graduation party actually. And it had been several years, and the family had finally decided as a group that there would be no more hospitalizations, medications did nothing. She could not, she herself, she was 22, I think, could not guarantee that she would be alive the next day. So she came with her mother, and I said, well, I'll be here. And she says, well, I may be, I don't know. I just don't know. And that was a family decision. Much to my pleasure, she did come, and the treatment I do is completely passive. You sit with your eyes closed. There are sensors on the head that pick up the brainwave, goes to a computer, which sends back a tiny signal to the brain that's in the same level of power as what the brain itself produces, so people don't have negative reactions.
Okay.
Which is really nice.
Uh-huh.
And people ask me, you know, what do you do? And I say, well, I do really weird stuff, because I still think it's weird. We've treated over 3,000 people now, and I still think it's weird.
Mm-hmm.
So what happened in this first session with her, I could see her smiling, and they're short. Right now, the longest we do is 4 minutes, active feedback. So the computer and the brain are talking to each other. So that's the neurofeedback. The brainwave energy is being read by the computer. It sends back a little signal that tickles it to change its neurotransmitter functioning. But I saw her smiling. I thought, well, that's weird. And when we finished, she said, that was really interesting. Yeah, what happened? Well, I found myself thinking about what I'll get my boss for her birthday, but that's not for 2 weeks, and I wasn't going to be alive. And her fiance had finally, after 3 years, said, I can't wait anymore. She said, I can get a new boyfriend. And this time it'll be somebody who's athletic. She was never suicidal again.
Wow.
A few years later, and we had, I think, about 15, 20 treatments maybe. I heard my name in a grocery store parking lot, and there she was carrying her son,
Aww.
a toddler. So that and some other very interesting things made me think this is really different, because this, even at that stage, was different from the typical and still very powerful neurofeedback, which is a learning process. You watch a movie and it plays if you're balancing the way your brain is firing, but it takes a lot of sessions. In my office, we sometimes combine the two depending upon a brain map. So we actually make a visual tracing and a thing we call a map that shows the balance or imbalance in the way the brain's firing. If there's an imbalance, people will be symptomatic.
So what you're saying is that when someone has a trauma of some kind, and either an emotional trauma or a physical trauma to the brain, that there's a type of firing that goes on, and that the use of neurofeedback can change the way the brain is firing.
Absolutely, absolutely. I have a real problem with the term PTSD. It is not a disability. It is not a disorder. It can produce a disability, but it is not a disorder, because in my world, it means your brain is doing what it's supposed to do. The brain's #1 job is to keep us alive.
Okay.
When we go through traumas, that is the danger. We're going to die, right? So its job is to say, hey, that little tiny sound, that could be a problem. And when one is, as our veterans have been through trauma after trauma after trauma, the brain should not react.
Right.
It doesn't care where your body is.
Right.
Then its job is to keep you alive. So I think of it as being a functional fusion of the parts of the brain that have to do with memory, which has to do with survival, and sensory issues, being hypersensitive to smells, sounds, touch, any change in the environment.
So when someone's in survival mode, what's happening is you're hypersensitive, you're feeling danger, you're feeling a whole range of things. And if you feel that way all the time, your brain is firing certain signals, and you can change those firings so that they don't feel in that hypersensitive mode anymore.
The brain can go back to a larger job. Now, primary is always going to be, to some degree, staying alive.
Right.
But then we have other things we have to do, like earn a living, right?
Right.
You
Right.
need to eat,
Sing,
you
dance.
you need to hopefully have some fun. So a life example is, first I treated before I did the research, which we now have published with Iraq, Afghanistan veterans, I was treating a prisoner of war from Korea, Vietnam War. He was in Hanoi Hilton for 5 years.
Oh my goodness.
And in pretty bad shape, and Walter Reed referred him. And it didn't take very long until he wasn't having these constant, strong responses to even just something like music. He didn't understand why it would do what it did. And his medications went down, his pain levels went down, everything was better. So I decided to start treating Iraq, Afghanistan veterans, because here we have all these people coming back with tremendous problems, which sounded like we probably could help without medication. So what has happened, and this is just one example, there was an Army sergeant who had been in 4 deployments, Afghanistan. She was stopped from committing suicide at Landstuhl. She'd been in Walter Reed through all of their programs, and the head therapist called me and said, "Can you see this person?" They're not supposed to refer out, but she did. So she would not, after being let off of the psych ward, she would not leave her quarters to get food unless she couldn't get somebody to bring her food, because she just couldn't tolerate. Well, after 4 treatments, she was walking down Georgia Avenue by herself to Silver Spring and said, I suddenly found myself at Borders, which doesn't exist anymore, but the bookstore, with my back to a window. Wait a minute, I'm not supposed to do this. So that was 2009. She now has her PhD in neuroscience.
Right.
When I finished, and there were only 25 sessions, 4 minutes, she said, I'm going to go to college, because now I know how to treat PTSD and traumatic brain injury, because she'd had plenty of those. And here she is.
Wow.
She's a doctor.
Wow.
Working in research in neuroscience. This is not unusual to have people go back to school, be able to go to school when they thought they couldn't.
Right.
To keep families together. The very first sergeant in that study was 3 years out of his service. He had been in the first wave going into Iraq, knocked out with explosions, sometimes more than 30 minutes, been at least 3 like that. He had shrapnel in a leg. He couldn't remember how old his kids were. He couldn't remember the day of the week for more than about 5 seconds. He didn't know his history. Family was living at Walter Reed, 4 kids. He still didn't know how old they were. And horrible headache and rages. So, what do you do with somebody like that? He'd been through several of the programs there.
He'd been through hell.
And still. So, third treatment, I was taking the sensors off the head. Again, 4 minutes. And he kind of made a little sound, and I thought maybe I'd scratched him or something. It was kind of like, oh. He says, I know what day it is. I know how old my kids are. And his wife and the youngest son, his wife had brought him, I had them come in. We talked for about an hour, and I would give anything if your crew here had been there, or there'd just been a tape recorder going.
Oh, how wonderful. Because
this little boy's sitting there, I don't know, he was 8 maybe, and this guy's just talking and talking and talking, and his wife said, well, what about that time when we were stationed at, I know she said someplace. He said, well, what do you mean? We were never stationed there. She said, well, you've been saying for 3 years that we were stationed at all these places. So the brain, when there's a vacuum, will fill it with, because it can't take that. It makes up stuff.
Right.
It's called confabulation. So it was an interesting conversation. And then something was said about someplace they'd been stationed in Texas. And the little boy, he'd been just watching his dad with these big eyes. And he said, Dad, we went to an amusement park. Oh yeah, and we rode this and that, and this kid's eyes got huge.
Aww.
Because they had had no history together.
And now they did.
Dad couldn't remember.
Right.
Now they did.
So how
and
do you...
then it was evening. He said, I am so hungry for peas and onions. And his wife's, really? That was always your favorite food, and you will have refused to eat it for the last 2 years.
Oh my
whatever.
goodness.
So the whole family changed, because now he could remember, he could take part. Of course, it caused upheaval because the wife had been completely in charge for all these years. But one day he came in, he was very quiet, and he said, which was unusual, he was a talker. He finally said, I just came from formation, and the third person in my formation shot himself at Walter Reed last night.
Oh.
And he said, I didn't tell you, but I was planning to kill myself when I came in. I hated my family. I think they hated me. Now my wife says she loves me, and now I'm a dad.
Oh.
How can I not do this? Because it keeps happening. Pain medicines go away. I mean, after, I don't know, third or fourth treatment, the docs took him off of this huge list of medications he'd been taking.
So we have, in our time that's left, can you tell us where you think this is going to be going in the future?
Well, what I hope, first of all, right now, there's a growing number of people, professionals in this country, there are more in Europe actually, but in this country, who are doing the traditional kind of neurofeedback as well as new varieties. And I urge people who have, you don't have to be a veteran, anybody who's had a TBI, has post-traumatic stress, they've been through all kinds of traumas, just look up neurofeedback providers and neurofeedback as a general term. But there's one specific organization, bcia.org. People are certified. Mm-hmm. You know they've been trained, because there are a lot of people realizing that this has power, but maybe they haven't got much experience. So we want everybody to get treatment if they can. And I think that the military medical folks are beginning to pay attention to this. Mm-hmm. It really should be available to every veteran. And actually, one of the vets was a medic in that first study. And unknown to me, until he had done it, he had sent a letter to Walter Reed officials saying, this should be available to every veteran returning, whether they think they need it or not.
Wow.
Because he had experienced, he was getting along, but struggling terribly.
Yeah. So I think the most important takeaway from all this is that if you are suffering, if you've had a concussion or a traumatic brain injury, or if you're suffering from PTSD, there are options available that you may not be aware of, and that it's up to you to find those options and search out people like Dr. Esty who can help you. This is Minda Wilson for It's Up to You.